All right, cool. So thanks, everybody. First thing I would like to do before we jump in is a few quick things. I'll start with a land acknowledgement. I know we're all coming from different parts of the state, and that's awesome, and appreciate you guys taking time to be here. I am in Seattle, so I would like to acknowledge that I live on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And I encourage you all to look up whose land you are currently occupying. And just be aware of the fact that we are on borrowed land with the original stewards, and we really appreciate them allowing us to be here. So a couple housekeeping things. We're recording, like I mentioned, please stay on mute. If you have questions, that is awesome. We would love to hear them, and we'll have a time to get to them at the end. Please put them in the chat so that we can record them on sort of a second document. If it's something we can answer right there, we'll do so, and if not, we'll bring them back up later. And I would first like to just quickly introduce our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to Tasia. So 3 people speaking tonight: myself, Tasia Wood. My name is Nick Manning, and I manage the climate program at Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. And Tasia manages the economic inequity program. So between the two of us, we collaborate a lot on some similar legislative priorities. And are really excited to be talking to you guys both about what we're doing this session and also how it's going to work. And then we are so thrilled to have Representative Harris-Talley join us towards the end of the presentation to just give a couple of tips and tricks, some of the insider perspective that is super valuable, and then also give a chance to introduce some of the legislation that she's going to be focusing on this session. So looking forward to that later in the program. But first, I will turn it over to Tasia.
Thank you, Nick. If we could go to the next slide, please. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're super grateful, as Nick said, that you're giving us some of your time. My name is Tasia Wood. I am the manager for the Economic Inequity and Health Program at WPSR, so kind of Nick's counterpart in the economic justice space. And I wanted to start by just kind of outlining 3 of the major goals we have for this evening and why we brought you all together here tonight. So the first thing is we just really want to emphasize how impactful the health voice can be in helping get critical pieces of legislation passed into law. So the reason that the health voice carries a lot of power in this process is because you come with expertise, you come with oftentimes clinical anecdotes that can really humanize what can be very sort of opaque and abstract policy concepts. And the other thing that's super relevant to our work is that you can make a really compelling case to legislators why policies that fall outside of the healthcare system really are public health policies. So you can make a pretty convincing argument, that tax is a public health issue when you look at the downstream health outcomes. This is, of course, more relevant than ever now, given that we are in the midst of the pandemic. We're looking at the world and especially policy through a health lens. So I want to underscore right off the bat that when I'm saying and we're referring to sort of the health voice, we're not just talking about physicians, even though that's in our, the name of our organization. We're talking about all people who look at policy through that health lens. So students, folks who are working across the spectrum of the health professions, people with lived experience of the health impacts of certain policies. So all of you are part of that health voice and can really have an impact in this space. Really, really importantly, and I want to be really clear about this because this has come up a couple times, is that this process is not only for citizens or people who can vote in this country. If you're an immigrant, if you're a resident of Washington State, these policies impact you, and you have every right to make your voice heard through all the ways that we're going to outline tonight, through public testimony, through writing op-eds and letters to the editor, through making calls. So everything we go through tonight, you can participate in whether or not you are a citizen. So that's sort of like the long-winded overview of goal 1. Goal 2 is just to really, as Nick said, demystify this process, to break it down, to make it feel more accessible. Theoretically, this is, the legislature is designed to support public engagement. In reality, It can feel pretty intimidating. It can feel pretty opaque and confusing. So we just want to take it down to the basics and like go through step by step. How does a bill become a law in Washington? And how do you engage in that process? And then third, as Nick said, we're just so excited to introduce you to an amazing legislator, Rep. Harris Talley, who's a champion for climate, racial, economic justice, and can give us some tips, insider tips and tricks about how to be effective advocates. So she'll be joining a little later on. Next slide, please. So kind of already went through this basic overview. We'll go over the legislative process. We'll highlight key moments for advocacy in that process. We'll have a special guest speaker, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so this is sort of Washington Legislature 101. Scaling up just kind of might be a reminder for some folks, but it's good basics to start with. Washington State is divided into 49 legislative districts, and each district has 2 representatives and 1 senator. These elected officials occupy the 2 chambers of the state legislature, the House and the Senate. In Washington, Democrats hold a majority in both chambers. So in the Senate, a 28-21 majority, in the House, 57-41. And then of course, we also have a Democratic governor. In Washington, the legislature operates on a 2-year biennium. So effectively, that means that one cycle of the legislative process takes 2 years. More specifically, that means that we pass or reenact a 2-year budget. So it lasts for a 2-year cycle. Those budgets always start in odd years. So in 2021, the legislative session we had in January, that was year 1. That was the odd year of the session. It was 105 days, and the focus was really on passing that biennial budget. We're now in year 2, so heading into January 2022. This is the short session. It's only 60 days, and this is where the focus is a little different. It's kind of, new legislation is introduced, and some really important stuff will be introduced and passed, hopefully. But it's also an opportunity to give some technical fixes to bills that were passed in the last session, and also to pass a supplemental budget to carry us through sort of to the end of that biennium based on changes that have occurred since the last session. Session always starts on the second Monday in January. And like I said, it's a short session. So this year it goes until March 10th. Next slide. Okay, this slide shows the life cycle of a bill. And I know it looks like quite convoluted probably. And we're going to break it down. We'll go step by step through this. But right now, I just want to bring your attention to, if you look on the left side of that image, you'll see a bunch of arrows directing to a gravestone. And this is symbolizing all the ways that a bill can die throughout the legislative process. So, yeah, and we'll go through that in committee, on the floor, et cetera. The flip side to all these opportunities for a bill to die is that there's also a lot of opportunities for you to engage in that process and prevent it from getting to that point if you want the bill to pass, or you can also help support it, try to kill the bill effectively. And so there's on the Washington State Legislature's website, you can track bills and see where they are throughout this process, and we'll send in our follow-up email a link to that. But let's start with Nick taking us through step 1 in this process, which is the first reading.
Yeah, thank you, Deja. Next, do you mind doing the next slide? So let's dive in. That was a big complicated diagram, but you can take it sort of step by step, and it always shakes out to be less complicated than it looks upon first glance. But start at the very beginning. Where does legislation come from? Well, at the beginning of a biennium, a legislator or their staff, sometimes coalition partners will write draft bill language and present it to legislatures. Sometimes advocates can write a draft bill and introduce it with the legislative sponsor. Sometimes a legislature asks their staff to write a certain bill that they would like to introduce that session. But you start with an idea, and anybody can come up with that idea so long as you find a primary sponsor. meaning you find a legislature who is going to champion that legislation and carry it through the process as the primary sponsor of that bill. And then when you file a bill with a primary sponsor, you have 24 hours to collect additional support in the form of co-sponsors, which is a lot of the legwork that needs to go into a bill before it gets introduced to make sure that has enough support to really have a fighting chance in this process. One thing to mention too is because we're in the second year of the biennium this year, bills that didn't get killed last year, but wound up, maybe they ran out of the committee date, maybe they didn't get out of committee before the cutoff date, whatever it is, all those bills are automatically reintroduced for the second year of that biennium. So anything that was alive last year that never had a definitive end will come back again this year. And that's true for the second year of any 2-year biennium. So we have a piece of legislation, a legislator or anybody drafts bill language, collects support, gets a primary sponsor. The first thing that they do is file it. And then the first thing that happens during legislative session is that the bill gets read on the floor in what's called the first reading. This is where leadership really decides which bills they would like to assign to specific policy committees. So if we can go to the next slide really quick, I'll expand on that. So all bills that are pre-filed are read by leadership to the full floor, and then the leadership decides which committees a bill will be referred to, usually by the subject matter of the bill. If they contain a fiscal note or if they raise revenue, so if they spend money or if they raise money, then they have to go to a policy committee and then also a fiscal committee. In the Senate, there are 2 fiscal committees. That's the Ways and Means Committee and the Transportation Committee. And in the House, you have the Appropriations Committee, the Finance Committee, Capital Budget Committee, and there's also a House Transportation Committee. So the fiscal note of a bill reports the appropriation for that bill if one is required, and in which case it will go through a policy committee and then also a fiscal committee. If we could go to the next slide really quick, I'll talk about what that means. So you have a bill. Leadership reads the bill, filters it to a specific committee based on the content of that bill, matching with one of the policy committees that deals with that content. For example, in the House, the Environment Committee is something that the climate program works with a lot. The chair of each committee works with staff and leadership to schedule which bills will be heard by the committee. And here's a really important first huge bottleneck in this process and a big advocacy opportunity is that committee chairs, and each legislator has to be the chair of one committee and the co-chair of another committee, and they rotate on a biennium. But the committee chair has full discretion over which bills to pull given to them by leadership to be heard in their committee. And this is the first place where it's really easy for a bill to die, because a committee chair can choose not to have that bill be heard in their committee, and then the bill just doesn't go anywhere until it passes the cutoff date, and then all of a sudden it's not going to be alive that session. Many of you have probably run into this a lot with, and I don't mean to call people out, but for example, Hobbs in the Transportation Committee stopping a lot of climate legislation as it gets into his hands just because he can choose which ones to pass through that committee. The committees then have 3 kinds of meetings. They have work sessions where the committee talks to determine the issues and review them. They have public hearings, and that's where we come in. And that's where everybody gets on the stand and has a chance to, the first chance for advocates to let their full chamber know what they think of this bill. And this is the first place where we really try to galvanize a lot of support, because it's this intersection on the first reading where we have the first chance to let people know what we think of this bill, to really get the word in. So we really try and push for public hearings. And then they'll do an executive session where the committee votes on what to do with the bill, for which there are 3 options. They could pass the bill as written, they could pass the bill with small amendments, or they could pass a substitute of the bill. And in whichever case, it kind of turns out of the first committee and then goes to the Rules Committee, but I'll let Tasia talk about that. Really quick, if Max, do you mind going to the next slide? Just one last thing about committees. Just a quick guide for advocacy here. This is really important. I know I said that, but I want to harp on it, because the first reading that it gets and the first committee hearing that it gets is the first chance for us as advocates to show support for this bill. So what can we do this session? Well, it's remote again. There's a couple ways that we can engage in public hearings. And the most common ones that we try to mobilize the most are giving live testimony. That's always great. Signing up and actually speaking to the chamber, or to the committee rather. You can write written comments. There's a portal to do that, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. You can sign in pro and con, so everybody has an option to indicate whether or not they are or are not in support of this bill. Without a comment, you just indicate whether or not you're in support. And then you can meet with committee leaders and membership, and that's super key because it's really important to make sure, especially if you're a constituent of a committee chair who's on a key committee for some priority that you think is really important, to get their ear and make sure they know they need to pass that bill to their committee to release it for the full committee so it can move on in the process. And this is the first place where we really try and hammer before bills can die. This is the first time they can die very easily. Then if it gets out of the policy committee and fiscal committees, for which the process is the same, it goes to rules. And I will let Tasia take that over.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so next slide, please. So bill's on its journey. It's gone through the policy or fiscal committee. It's had a public hearing. It's had an executive session. It's been voted out of that committee. The committee makes a recommendation to pass that bill out of the committee, and it is referred to the rules committee. So the rules committee is this important step in the process, and it functions a little differently than the other types of committees. It's often referred to as the gatekeeper of the legislature because this is where rules members get to decide which bills make it to the floor for a full chamber debate and vote. So this is a really key part in this process. Some things about the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is where the majority party exercises the most amount of control. So members of the Rules Committee are made up of both members of both parties, but they're always weighted with members of the majority party. So in a Rules Committee meeting, each member of the committee is able to choose 2 or 3 bills that's decided by the majority leader to move on to the next step in the process. This is called pulling a bill. So if you pull a bill, or if a member pulls a bill, then that moves on to the short list. And so essentially what happens is the next meeting, members will then go through that short list and debate and take a vote, typically just a voice yay or nay vote. And if it passes, then it can move on to the full floor. So this is often, a pretty coordinated process directed by leadership. Leadership has a big role in working with Rules Committee members to pass caucus priority bills. But advocacy directed at members of the Rule Committee is super important because, like we said, each one of them has, the ability to pull these bills. So the other thing is when you lobby Rules Committee members, you're also giving a signal to leadership around what the constituents' priorities are, because this is such an integrated process with leadership. So really recommend looking up whether or not your senators and your representatives are on the Rules Committee. You can look that up on the Washington State Legislature website. There's direct links in the slides, which we'll send out later. But yeah, it's a really key, it's a very powerful position. So it's good to note that going into the legislative session. Next slide, please. Okay, so then it moves out of the Rules Committee and then it goes to the floor. And this is the first opportunity where the full chamber has the opportunity to read the full bill, to debate the bill, and to offer amendments. And so if amendments are offered during this process, they are voted on. If they pass, then all of the amendments that are passed are engrossed. The bill is ordered engrossed, which just means that all the amendments are incorporated into that bill. So it's one cohesive document. Once that happens, then it goes to the third reading. So next slide. And the third reading is the final step in the process in the Chamber of Origin. So the third meeting is where there's a roll call vote. And so that's where all members in the chamber get to vote in favor or in opposition to the bill. If the bill fails to get a majority vote, goes no further, path to death of a bill. If it passes, then it continues on to the opposite chamber and basically goes through the entire process, which we'll get to in a minute all over again. In terms of advocacy, this is another key moment, because this is where, developing a relationship with your elected official is really important. It's sort of this equalizing moment where up until this point, as you can see, the committee chairs and caucus leadership really have a disproportionate control over the bill. But the third reading is where every member gets an equal vote. So you don't have to be in a key, district for your voice to be really important at this stage. If you know that your bill or bill that you really care about is scheduled for a third reading, we always encourage you to, reach out to your legislator and let them know how you want them to vote. Next slide. So if it passes out of that first chamber, then it goes to the second chamber, and the whole process starts all over again, subject to all the same roadblocks, subject to all the same bottlenecks as in the first chamber. If it makes it through that whole process again without any new amendments being introduced, then the bill passes and it goes to the governor's desk and it has the opportunity to be signed into law. However, in the second chamber, as is often the case, new amendments will be introduced. And now Nick is going to go over what happens when a bill is amended outside of its chamber of origin.
Yes, can we do the next slide, please? So, best case scenario, right? The House or the Senate passed legislation, and either it's engrossed or not or whatever. It has a final version of a piece of legislation that it passed. And the opposite chamber is like, yep, that looks great. We vote yay. And then it just goes to the governor. That's rare, though. That very rarely happens. Oftentimes, both chambers have conflicting interests or opinions that they would like to put into the bill. And there's a lot of discussion that goes into that. So there's a couple things that can happen here. If a bill passes out of the chamber of origin and the opposite chamber decides not to pass it or to amend it, then it has to come back to the first chamber. So if a bill has been amended by the second house, the first has to decide whether it will concur in the amendments or not. In one case, they could say, those are fine amendments. We agree, we pass it. And then the bill goes on to the governor. In the case that they don't agree with the amendments, which is more often the case, that say the House will not concur with changes the Senate made to a bill that originated in the House, then they have a couple options. They can ask the second House to rescind their amendments, which in this case, if it passed out of the House and then goes to the Senate would just rescind their amendments, take it back, and then the House would pass, and then that goes to the governor. Or if both chambers can't agree on a final version to pass, they have to go into what's called a concurrence process and conference committee, where you have members of both chambers and members of both parties coming together in a special committee to hammer out the details and try and figure out a compromise version of the bill to pass back to both chambers. So if they can agree and come up with some middle ground, which happens all the time, to reconcile the changes that each chamber wants to add to this bill, that's great. They come out with a new version, and that version has to go back to both chambers to get voted on again as a new bill with all the amendments engrossed. And if it can get voted out of both chambers, then it goes to the governor. If at any point there is a disagreement and we cannot get the vote from both chambers on the same version of a bill, the bill dies. So it's really a big process and compromise going to concurrence committee to try and this is where the middle ground, this is where all the negotiating happens between the chambers, where they really hammer out the merits of certain amendments or give concessions. This is where kind of like the sausage really gets made as far as passing a final version of the bill. And then next slide, please. So a couple options here, right? Both chambers agree on a version, great. One chamber disagrees and the first chamber asks them to reconsider and they do, great. One chamber disagrees and the other chamber asks them to reconsider and they don't, conference committee. And if they can agree after that and pass both houses, great. In any of those scenarios, if a bill gets out of both chambers and can head to the governor, then a certificate proclaiming that it's passed is attached, and if necessary, the amendments from the second house or conference committee are incorporated into the body of the bill. The bill is then signed by the Speaker of the House, the Chief Clerk of the House, the President of the Senate, and the Secretary of the Senate, and is sent to the governor for his or her action. In Washington state, the governor does not need to sign the bill for it to pass. It's usually a political calculation more than anything, whether Inslee wants to put his name on a particular piece of information. But in Washington state, even if Inslee does not sign it in time, if those other actors have, it still passes. And this is often used as sort of like to protect a record, or Inslee wants to be very vocal about opposition to something or not, but he doesn't have power to kill bills by not signing them. However, he can veto them. And in Washington, the governor has section veto power. So there's a couple nuances here. The governor can veto the whole bill, he can say nope. And then the bill goes back to both chambers. And if they can get 2/3 majority in both chambers, they override the veto and it becomes law anyway. In Washington state, though, the governor also has the power to veto sections of the bill. However, not line items. And here's where a lot of the controversy last year came into play, especially as Governor Inslee was vetoing line items of the Clean Fuel Standard bill that was challenged. And it's pretty clear in state law that while Inslee can, or whoever the governor is, can veto sections, they're not allowed to do line item vetoes. So last year, this played out a lot because, for example, in the Climate Commitment Act, you had Inslee vetoing section 22, which was the definition of the tribal consultation. That is legal technically because he's vetoing the whole section. However, the vetoes he did in the Clean Fuel Standard are not legal because he can't do line items in the section without the whole section. So this is where we get into some legal conflicts sometimes, and Inslee's actually been in hot water recently because he's tried to do line item vetoes and people have challenged it. But essentially, the veto power is powerful and most often used for section vetoes rather than vetoing a whole bill. And then we're going to do a quick recap of that process. So I'll turn it back over to Tasia, and then I can talk about some differences this year as well.
Cool, thanks, Nick. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a lot of info for half an hour. So just quickly recap, and if it's overwhelming, again, this is a process that takes some time to kind of get used to, and also we're going to send out more resources so you can read through it later on. But just to kind of big picture recap, a bill is introduced. It's assigned to a policy or fiscal committee or both. It has a hearing. If it makes it through that committee, then it goes to the rules committee. If it gets pulled out of the rules committee, then it goes to the floor. Then it has a full chamber vote, and then it moves on to the next chamber, and it goes through the whole process again. And then, depending on what happens in that second chamber, it either goes straight to the governor's desk or there's a reconciliation process. So those are sort of the key steps. Now, the key ways to engage in that process, the sort of big one is comments. So this includes public testimony, so giving public testimony in a public hearing, or written comments. This is where you can bring up specific issues that you have with a bill. So for example, if you like the majority of the bill, but there's a section that you really don't like, you can, be nuanced. That's particularly accessible in written comments more than public comments, which is typically limited to 60 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. So you can bring up those nuances. You can just straight out, explain why you love this bill or why it is key for the health of our state. You can outline why you really dislike the bill and why it's detrimental to the health of our communities. It's basically your chance to enter your opinion into the legislative record. So that's one major piece. The other major piece is lobbying. And so this is throughout the legislative session. We're lobbying, we're making calls, we're writing, we're sending letters, we're having meetings with legislators. But it's important to note that through that process, through the legislative session, legislators are super busy, like really, really busy. And so that's not to say you can't have a meeting with them. It just means that it might be a really short meeting. It might take a couple of weeks to schedule it. So now in this pre-session time, as we're leading up to January, it's actually a really good time to reach out to your legislators and set up a meeting with them. because they'll have more time and they really want to hear from you as they're developing their own legislative priorities heading into session. So also just want to acknowledge saying like, hey, go set up a meeting with your legislator might be kind of intimidating, might be confusing how that happens. So, you know, there's often, I have felt in the past that, you know, there's a big degree of separation between us as constituents and our elected officials. But the thing is, and I'm sure Nick would say this too, that they're just people. Like when you talk with them, they're just people. They have day jobs. They're people who care so much about their communities that they've decided to run for public office, and they want to hear from you. They want to hear from their constituents. That's their job and their responsibility, but they really want to have those conversations. And also when you schedule a constituent meeting, it's typically only 15 minutes, typically quite casual. And it's just a really good opportunity to introduce yourself, to learn about your elected officials' legislative priorities, and also to share your own priorities and to talk about what's going on in your communities. So setting up a meeting with your legislator is also pretty simple. So a couple ways to schedule. Basically, you can just Google them. You can Google your elected official, and that will usually, one of the first hits will be their personal homepage. Alternatively, you can go through the Washington State Legislature website and you find the roster of representatives or senators. You click on them, there'll be a link to their personal homepage that will take you to a new page. And on that page, there'll be a contact me button or tab. Click on that. Typically one of two things will happen. Either it will just list straight up their email address and the email address of their legislative assistant. And then you can just email them directly. And if you email them, always copy their legislative assistant, because they are key they handle most of scheduling. Alternatively, it might take you to like a portal or a form where it'll have fields for you to fill out. And those will be typically quite clear: name, contact info, date you want to meet, what you want to meet about. And then you just submit that and you should hear back. If you are emailing directly, we've put a couple things on the slide that we would recommend including in that email. So your name and your district, probably the most important. They want to know if you're a constituent. If you have a particular bill number, a particular bill, you can indicate that you really want to speak about, or just more generally what the issue is that you want to talk to your legislator about. Note if you're meeting as an individual or as part of a group. Note how many total participants will be in this meeting, and then provide a range of days that you're available, because schedules are full. So you want to off the bat provide a couple options that hopefully they can find one that works. And then just the last thing to note, if you can't find a time to meet with your legislator, like if your schedules just do not line up, you can also request to speak with a staffer. Staff are super knowledgeable. They'll pass all your information on to your legislator. They have super valuable insights. So we really encourage you to reach out. And if you're advocating for any of the issues that we're working on, that we'll sort of go over in a very, very high level way in a minute, you can reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to support you in that process, helping do outreach, helping provide talking points, joining us for a meeting, that kind of thing. Back to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. This is gonna be on the next slide too, but I'm just putting our emails in the chat so that people can have them just in case. Okay, so 200-pound gorilla, we're still in COVID and things are not operating normally. So we thought it would be good to draw a little bit of attention to what's different this year. And I've already seen some questions in the chat to this effect. So I'm glad that you guys are thinking about this, because there are some small differences and it will be operating a little differently. The first is that we're still doing virtual sessions. Actually, maybe when we hear from Representative Harris-Talley, she can correct me if I am getting details about this wrong, but I believe there's like some hybrid elements where they might have certain people in the Capitol, but on the whole, it's virtual this year. So we're still going to be engaging through the portal, through direct contact with legislatures, and then through testimony at committee hearings, rather than like all coming down to Olympia for one lobby day.
Yeah, so what I know so far with engagement is that all of our committee work and testimony will be all online. I'm really excited. We saw a 600% increase in neighbor versus lobbyist influence in committee testimony, which I think made a big difference for our democracy. And you're correct, there will be options for folks to visit the Capitol, but we will have vaccination and or negative test results needed for all who engage for any on-campus activity. But our understanding is there will be some conduits and options for that with limitations of access on certain areas of campus.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Representative Harris-Talley, everybody. By the way, we haven't officially introduced you yet, but thanks so much for being here. And Tasia and I will turn it over to you in just a couple slides, but really appreciate you coming and speaking with us. Just a couple quick differences also about session this year. It's a short session, like we mentioned. It's not a budget year, and I saw a question about this in the chat, so I wanted to mention it as well. In off years and short sessions, in the even years, they don't pass a new biennium budget, but they do pass a supplemental budget. The governor prepares a supplemental budget that operates very much like a bill as it runs through both chambers for people to add provisos to then update anything we need to update in the biennium bill. So say we're going to raise more money than we thought, or say we have to spend more money than we thought, that needs to be reflected in the supplemental budget so that we can finish out the biennium accounting for the money that we weren't expecting or maybe wasn't reflected in the budget as it was passed in the even years. This year, there are going to be 3 supplemental budgets. Normally, the governor does a supplemental operating budget, but the transportation, the capital, and the operating budget are all going to have supplemental budgets this year because we're getting a lot of money from disparate sources and we need to figure out how to spend that revenue. So a big focus this year is going to be figuring out how to write the money that's coming into the state through things like Build Back Better, the Clean Fuel Standard, other policies that have passed that are raising revenue for us. A lot of this session is going to be writing that money into a supplemental budget so we can figure out how we're going to spend a lot of the revenue coming into the state. And that's really key this year because that will be where a lot of the details of these policies and the implementation get funded, which is so critical. As much as passing things, funding them is really, really, really important. So advocacy at budget committees this year, I think, is going to be super, super key. And then the last thing, really quickly, Max, I think you're going backwards, is that working in coalition is really important. There's a couple of different tips for testifying this year that we've received as advice from various legislators. One thing, just a couple things to mention that I think might be useful to you guys. One piece of advice that we got from Representative Paulette is no one really read the written comments last year from the online portal. So where possible, email your comments directly to your legislators. I think that's really key. Number 2, testifying is much better in a panel. So it's more effective, we found in this virtual session, to sign up a panel of speakers about a certain bill, which means working in coalition and putting together a suite of people that can really represent a lot of what we're trying to get at with whatever that legislation is super important. And Tasia and I will be working to do that through sessions so that we can be as effective as possible. Okay, that is that. We have one slide left where Tasia and I will super quickly go through kind of general priorities for this year, and then we'll turn it over to Representative Harris-Talley. So a lot's being formulated, right? Like we're still trying to figure out final versions of bills, and we wanted to give you a preview of kind of generally direction where our programs think that we're headed, but please keep in mind that a lot of this is preliminary. A lot of information is still coming in, especially for the climate program. I'm still waiting on final bill versions. So here's a preview, but don't take this as written in stone quite yet because things are still subject to change. But generally speaking, a couple things on the radar for the climate program specifically are a package of bills that Alex Rommel is introducing from the 40th district to electrify the building sector. There's going to be 4 bills in that package that are kind of all pieces that we introduced last year in 1084 being broken up into 4 bills. And then the budget work that I was kind of mentioning, really keeping tabs on what money is being spent on, where it's coming in, making sure that we are allocating, for example, money from the Climate Commitment Act to real resilience and adaptation projects, especially in the most frontline and impacted communities. So really keeping an eye on that is something that I'm going to be trying to do a lot this session. And then I'll let Representative Harris-Talley talk about this bill because she'll be able to speak to it way better than I ever could, but also looking at 1490, which would provide assistance to low and middle income households for electric utility bills. And then I'll let Tasia kind of go over her.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Okay, so similarly, kind of big picture stuff here. For our economic inequity program, we have two big bucket areas that we prioritize, that we are prioritizing this session. And that is progressive tax reform and housing and health. So folks might be aware that Washington has the most inequitable regressive tax code in the country. And so we really want to work towards reforming that tax code, raising progressive revenue that we can then invest in our social programs, our health, our housing, invest back into our communities. So that is our first big bucket area. And there's lots of bills that are being discussed in that space. You might have heard of the wealth tax that Rep. Frame introduced last year. That's a tax, a 1% tax on, well, we'll see how it looks this session, but one iteration of it is a 1% tax on intangible assets over $1 billion or on over $1 billion. Other bills, prospective bills in the tax space, reforms to the estate tax, also looking at potentially a guaranteed basic income legislation. In the housing space, we're looking at potentially some bills around rent stabilization and rent control, or renter's credit. There's a bill that Rep. Chop is introducing that will is called functionally a housing prescription bill that would be providing prescriptions for housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness with a diagnosed behavioral health disease. So that would be trying to address this specific population of unhoused folks through the health care system. And then again, this should be on the slide, but HB 1494, which is another one of Rep. Harris-Talley's bills that we're really excited about, which is an anti-displacement property tax exemption to essentially prevent the displacement of lower income and largely BIPOC homeowners from being priced out of home ownership because of rising property tax rates. So that's sort of the big picture preview, and we'll have more information in January. But now I'd like to pass it back to Nick to introduce our special guest speaker for tonight.
Yeah, thank you. And we previewed this because we're so excited to have Representative Harris-Talley with us today, but I'll just do a quick intro and then I will turn it over to you, Representative, and you can take it. So Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley is a mother, educator, wife, neighbor that lives in the 37th Legislative District. She was first elected to the legislature in 2020, and she serves on the Children, Youth, and Families Committee as a vice chair and the Environment, Energy, and Finance Committees. She's lived in the 37th District since 2004, and it was here in Rainier Valley in the 37th District where she found her voice for activism. She and her husband, Jason, are proud to raise 2 children in Hillman City, and there is no place they'd rather call home. And we are so lucky to have her. Thank you so much, Representative, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you all for inviting me and the work you do in community. I see some familiar faces of neighbors and others I've had the pleasure of crossing paths with over the years. So thank you so much for having me. Representative Kirsten Harris-Talley, she, her pronouns, and thank you for that great introduction, Nick. I feel really honored to serve the 37th Legislative District alongside Representative Santos, who's, I think, coming into her 23rd session representing our district, and Senator Rebecca Saldana, who I know from a lot of organizing and particularly climate resiliency work before she was even a senator serving. So we have the only women, all women of color delegation in the state, and we work very collaboratively together towards equity and justice. My roots come from community. I interviewed for this job because a lot of neighbors asked me to. I started my work in reproductive justice work, so very much appreciate that you all have this space talking about it. From everything I heard just in the little bit of time of hearing your policy purview, a very intersectional lens of what we need to be healthy and whole people. So I appreciate that. I feel very honored that reproductive justice was my political home because that came from such a holistic lens of the most impacted people being able to give voice of what they need for change. So I bring a lot of that into the work I do. I serve on Children, Youth, and Families Committee. It's a catch-all committee. Anything that impacts our children that doesn't go through Public Education Committee really goes through that committee. So a lot of our healthcare infrastructure, also our youth adjudication and incarceration systems, I take particular focus there. I'm the only out, as far as I know, always working on more colleagues join me on being out abolitionists. I'm an abolitionist in the clearest sense of that word. As an abolitionist, I am standing on the shoulders of folks who've been now 4 centuries in a fight to end slavery in this country and on this planet. And I believe in a future where we have alternatives so we don't have to keep turning to incarceration as a solution, which it is not. So we have a lot more work to do there. And I also work on issues. I'm a budget nerd. I believe that budgets are moral documents. Martin Luther King Jr. was the first to say that. And I believe that means where we get our money is important and how we steward those public dollars. So both sides of that equation. It is not an accident that we live in Washington State with the most upside down tax code in the entire country. It was built that way on purpose. And we need to do a lot to make it right so that working families and individuals can, quite frankly, survive, let alone thrive. We need to do a lot more to have them thrive. So really believe that the resource part of the equation is really important. So I don't know with this, Nick, where you wanted to go from here, but that's just a little more about me, my roots and where I come from and sort of my values that I bring to the work. And I can start anywhere. Reflections on last session, what's happening now, what's ahead, what feels relevant and helpful for you all.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. And that context is great. I think, and Tasia, please feel free to jump in here. I think what we were really thinking would be super helpful is inside scoop, like what advice can you give us as advocates that are going to be trying to operate this year during session to be really effective, especially because it's so different this year? And what are some tips that you have as an insider that we could maybe mobilize?
Well, I am bringing you the clear lens of what it is to be an insider with new eyes in a way that we've never legislated before. So I'm offering all I can in that container. I say that because, 2 years ago, someone had told me, oh, our entire public school infrastructure will find a way for every kid to have a laptop and our legislature will do everything online. I would have said, how is that possible? I'm really excited about what I already shared about the fact that we're keeping committee work online. I think that is a huge advantage for advocacy groups. My favorite thing to hear during interim, and I'm still hearing it, is that I have not met all the lobbyists in Olympia. I still have not met all the lobbyists in Olympia. I really rarely accept meetings with lobbyists in Olympia over my meetings with my neighbors. Yes, that is true. That's part of the ethos of our office. But the truth is they have not had access to us. 90% of lobbyists having access to me and my colleagues is actually the walk from the hall to my office, to the restroom, to the cafeteria, right? Because that's actually, it's those 2-minute conversations in there where they're swaying our attention and our perspectives. What that meant is that we had far more intensive quality time in caucus. I've been telling advocates that because know who your legislators are, who you trust, make sure they're telling you what's happening in real time. And because the influence of lobbyists has been lessened, and I'm hoping that's something that's going to continue. So that's one advantage. The second piece is I am not the only one who took full advantage of what it was to be really prescriptive and intentional about how I structured testimony, yes, no, voices and things on my bills. So if you all know that you're the experts to give testimony on bills, or hook up with us now, because I'm already starting to plan, what's the story I'm going to be telling during the hearings for the bills that I'm stewarding. Even those that are being revisited, what's the story I'm retelling for my neighbors and colleagues to understand. I grew up in rural Missouri. I'm a Black queer woman who grew up, in KKK country in the middle of nowhere, dirt poor, amongst dirt poor people. I did not understand income inequity until I went to college because just everyone was poor. And one thing I remember is we would do a lot of field trips to Jefferson City, which is the capital of Missouri. And one of my favorite, the school I went to was 50 kids. It was a very small school. And I had a really great history teacher then. I remember him one time, we went and he said, Don't be nervous talking to an elected official. Just assume they're all pig farmers. Now, the context being outside of rural Missouri, maybe that doesn't hit. But in essence, what he was saying is almost everyone you're going to meet, they know about one thing really, really well, but that doesn't mean they know about what you're talking about. And I go in as an organizer, assuming that every conversation I'm having is the start of them having a conversation they maybe never had before. So I spend a lot more time trying to figure out what they know about the issue and how to engage them as an organizer than just trying to tell them my spiel. And so I think that will be a huge advantage for you all in organizing, particularly because you all have so much more airtime with colleagues. So I think about that a lot with the tax equity space. For instance, I'm a tax nerd. I understand the nuances of our tax code so well, right? And a lot of my colleagues, when you say taxes, it sounds overwhelming and they don't want to sit and talk about it. So I've honed down the really simple ways to talk about things. So the wealth tax, right? When I sit down and talk to colleagues who have no idea, I'm like, how much do you pay in taxes? And they tell me, and I go, do you know the billionaire who lives down the street from you doesn't pay any of that? And do you know we have an option for them to actually be exempted for the first $1 billion they make and then only pay 1%? And for that to make this much revenue, they don't have to understand tax policy, right? To understand the story I just told them and that that's a potential and that that would make a difference. And hearing an exemption for $1 billion does not sound scary, right? So figure out what your little short story is that's not about the technical thing, but the story of what do we share as a value to start as a conversation. So those are the things I would say that I found in the online organizing space has been really effective, because we're also organizing with our colleagues online. I'm also not having 5-minute conversations with my colleagues on the way to the lunchroom, right? So I think we're all being organizers in this new space.
Thank you so much. That is awesome. It's always good to hear how we can try and be effective this year, but really appreciate you coming and sharing your perspective with us. So thank you so much. It is 6:54. We were going to do some questions and answers. So unless Representative, you have anything to say, or Tasia, you have anything else to say, I think maybe we can jump into the Q&A section. If that sounds good to you guys.
I just have one
to me, and I'm here till 7:15, just for a time check for me, however that fits with your agenda. Yeah.
That's when we'll be wrapping up too. So thank you so much. But I just have one more question for you before we open up for general Q&A, which is this group of folks here tonight are largely folks from the health professions or who are really interested in the health impacts of policies, both within healthcare, but also outside of the healthcare system. And I just wanted to get your insights into, why it's valuable to have these folks who, are really busy come out and advocate in this space, and what their voices can bring to the advocacy landscape.
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. I want to start by saying thank you to all of you, because we're in this moment in the pandemic that feels like a tenuous point. Contextually, the politicized conversations are about coming back and being in recovery and all of that. That is not what my neighbors are living, not by a stretch. We're also having conversations about people going back to work and getting back to the way it was before. And quite frankly, all of you and whatever you're doing in our healthcare spheres never walked away for a second and haven't had a moment of rest. So I want to name that your jobs were already very hard, and then a global pandemic hit in a country that was wholly, woefully unprepared for it. We are in a country that's in a lot of denial about the realities of how damn bad it is, and it's really, really bad. I have appreciated being in a caucus in a year when we came in, where we got to have really explicit conversations about that, and I want that to continue. So to do that, the thing I've appreciated most about the distance testimony is it's opened up tremendously the access point. I can listen to you sitting in the hall of wherever you're doing your work for the 2 minutes you have from wherever you are in the state, and you didn't have to take 2 days off work to hold down to Olympia to tell me what you need to tell me. I have literally folks, right, showing me literally in testimony on the computer in real time what's happening. That is tremendously powerful. You all are the frontline stories. You're seeing on the front line in very deep detail what we cannot see in any of what we're doing. And your experience and the experience of those you help and reflecting that back to us for us to actually understand what it means when these policies pass or get implemented is instrumental. So I think the value add is just your human to human experience and your willingness to share that story and hold us accountable to the stories that you're experiencing.
Oh man, let's go get him, you guys. Thank you so much for that answer. That's awesome to hear. And it's really good to know that there is a big impact that we can make at bringing a certain perspective that might not be brought otherwise. Tasia, let me know if this makes sense to you, but I'm thinking maybe for questions, we could have people raise hands and then call on them with questions, if that sounds okay. And then I can look if there's any in the chat that we did not get around to answering. I will start answering those in the chat as well. But so folks, if you have a question, please just raise your hand. You can do that by going down to the bottom little control panel and you hit reactions on there. And then there's a button that says raise hand. So go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, hit reactions, click raise hand, and we will call on you. Yes, Susan. Feel free to take yourself off mute once you get called on.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation this evening and hearing from the representative. I actually am a constituent of LD 26, so I work with Emily Randall quite a bit. The group that I work with is extremely concerned about the current situation in Washington with healthcare monopolies. I live in a county where we have 100% of our hospital beds being controlled by CHI Franciscan. I know that there's some legislation coming up this session, and I'm really hoping to hear some information about what some of those bills are and what we can do to deal with that situation as well.
Yes, thank you for naming that. So I've worn many hats in my career. My path has been a winding one, and one hat I wore was the executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Washington. Because I come from reproductive justice circles, I need to just name explicitly, I'm frustrated with the situation that we're having with faith-based hospitals in this state. I'm frustrated about it because I was literally at the table 18 years ago when the first merger was happening with Peace Hospital in San Juan County. Yeah. And everyone in the Death with Dignity movement and reproductive justice and rights movements all of us raised our hackles and said, y'all, this is the start and this is what it looks like. And we've seen this happen. We cannot be a state that's turning away access to all types and access to care because we are letting faith be in the mode of telling people what between them and their protection, what does and doesn't happen. I say I'm frustrated because the Virginia Mason merger was a moment where I think the state should have intervened. I think the executive should have taken a stand. I wish our insurance commissioner, there were a whole lot of folks who could have given voice. They did not. And that merger alone reduced by almost 30% the number of non-faith-based beds we have. Like when I tell people how few secular beds we have in King County, they are shocked. And this is another part, along with our tax code, I'm like, this is just about dollars and cents. It's not about health. It's not about care. It's about money. And the willingness for this state to stand and put our hands up that we can't do anything. It's not true, we can do something. I'm aware that there are a couple bills. I will be honest, the House, I think, is a more friendly space for that than the Senate. Most of the vehicles are being introduced in the Senate because, quite frankly, it's a place where we need to make the most headway. Now, that said, it's also the place that's had the most change since interim started. Like literally the makeup of the Senate has changed dramatically, particularly with the appointments that's happened. I'm very excited about Senator Trudeau joining us. I think she's going to be a great voice around this, having come from the AG's office. I know for a fact this is an issue she's keeping an eye on. I already heard folks name Senator Randall, Senator Wilson. I mean, there's a lot of champions who are raising it there. But I thank you for naming it. It's one of the scarier things happening in the state. For me and my family as well, my youngest child is a gender non-conforming child. I think about that all the time. Depending on where you are in the state, you are not getting access to equitable care. You're just not. If you don't have the right body, you're not getting it.
May I reach out to you outside of this? Because I'm actually with a grassroots group that's trying to deal with this.
I would love to, and I'd love to hook you up with some of the other groups doing the work.
Thank you.
I also want to note that one bill we're introducing, I'm very excited, that's coming from community work, somewhat tangentially related. 52% of births in this state happen under Medicaid. For folks who've ever had the pleasure of working with a doula, I had a doula with my birth experiences for both my children. It was transformative for me as a Black woman, having an advocate for my care and my births. And we are introducing a bill to have Medicaid coverage of doula services in the state. So I'm very excited about that. But we are going to have to then grapple with the reality of what will that look like when doulas are in hospital systems. So the reason I say that, right, is that everything then ultimately intersects with what system will they have to do this work within. And so it's always going to be a hurdle. So I would love to hear more from your group about what work you're doing. Thank
I
you.
will email you tonight. Thank you so very much.
So do we have any questions about process of the legislature really quick, just to put a pin on that? And then if not, we have a few more minutes to continue this discussion, because I really appreciate what you guys are bringing and how this is going. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I think I heard repeated tonight something that I heard from League of Women Voters, which was the time to contact your legislators is now, particularly if you have an idea that's not a bill or that you're not sure going to become a bill, because once this convoluted process that you, I don't want to, that outline, I'm just thinking of that one first graph that Deja showed. It's pretty complicated. That your best chance is right now. My question for Representative Harris-Talley: what are the other most important touch points if you're working on a bill to hear from us?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of an organizer, what are the 3 touches that are going to get me closer to the yes that I ultimately need for liberation in the work? So I would say in planning for the short session, talk to folks now. And when I say now, I mean by December 15th. Pre-filing opened up yesterday. Pre-filing will continue through the 9th of January. Session starts January 10th. Session ends March 10th. I think everyone here knows the activities all my colleagues in the House will be doing after leg session, which means our chances of going over 2 months to serve is very small chance. So the timeline for any new bills or anything that you want drafted or considered in the budget, the governor's budget's going to be coming out in a week and a half or less than now, 8 days. So by the 15th, everything lines up. The governor's budget's out. You'll start to have members thinking through and reviewing that for a response to that budget. That's going to create the context for everything we respond to with our budget line items in the House and Senate respectively that we then duke it out on. For anything with policy, if our chairs in the House are telling us, if they don't know by, I'm looking to see what date it is, that if they don't know by the bill by the 15th of January, chances are you're not going to get a hearing. And the reason for that is that in a short session, they just don't have as much hearing time. So if they don't know by the end of that very first full week in January, our chances, I can introduce as many bills as I want, but our chances of having it heard, going through the process are very low. Now, here's the advantage for you all. For those of us who were able to introduce really big comprehensive bills last year, we have a head start. So you already mentioned Rammel's electrification bill, for instance. That's one where we have a head start. I have a ranked choice voting bill, which is a local elections bill. It had gotten all the way to rules. I get to start from the start line of rules. So if you have a bill that you've been working with in community that the member already has it in the pipeline, hook up with them, ask them where it is in the process, because those of us who got our bills introduced last year have a little more runway that we've already gone down. But the other big pivot point for me is when budget deliberation and legislative session happens. Because for me, a bill's only as good as our ability to resource it and fund it. I think the working families tax credit is the most concrete example I have of that. Technically, the working families tax credit has been on the books and legal in Washington State for a decade, folks. We never funded it. We never put a penny behind it until this last legislative session. Now it's a real law. So technically it was on the books, but it wasn't doing anything to help people. So those are the pivot points I would look on that schedule. But I would identify your champions now, and I'm doing as many community seed conversations as I can do now. Any lobbyist that's contacting me, I'm saying, I'm not talking to you till leg session starts, but any community groups that reach me now, I want to have all the information I can now on how to advocate on their behalf. And so your champions reach out, and hopefully my other colleagues are doing the same. Are those helpful, Mark?
Yes.
And also, I work, and I think most of my colleagues who work in good faith, I try to work really explicitly with community to imagine how far we can push a bill to have it still be a win, even if we can't get it over the finish line. And I say that because to get it over the finish line in the House, I need 56 colleagues to agree with me. Then it goes to the Senate. I need to get it 51 people over there. Then it goes to the governor. I have to make sure he's not going to veto it or that he'll sign it. So there's a lot of things outside of my control about my bill. But if I can work with community and know, like our ranked choice voting bill last year, we got it 4 steps further than we ever got it before, and knew we would be pulling it from rules in the second year. That was a huge win for what we're going into now. So try to set your terrain of what your expectations are for how far the work your champion can get, and just try to set that with the folks early on too.
Thank you, guys. So it's all right, 7:09, and you guys have really fantastic questions. Thank you, everybody, for being so engaged. I think we probably have room for one more for Representative Harris-Talley, and then Tasia and I will do a super quick wrap-up slide, and then we'll all enjoy the rest of our evenings. So if anybody has a final question, there are a lot to pick from too, so not sure how to be equitable about this. Yeah, Charles, go ahead.
Hi, Rep Harris-Talley. You are awesome. Am I on? Maybe you're not on. Can you hear me?
You, yeah.
you're good.
Yes, thank
Great.
you. That's
Okay.
so kind.
I just want to say we are behind you. We have got your back. We love you. So yeah, we like the things you're doing. I'm a co-chair with Tasia with our economic inequity and racial inequity task force. So 2 quick questions. Maybe I'm only allowed one, so throw out whichever one you want. One is you are working on the property tax, bill, and I was curious. Maybe we don't have time, but if you can tell us a little bit about strategy and how we can help. The second question is particularly near and dear to my heart is the Washington Cares Fund. It's been in the paper, they're trying to fight it. And it seems to me that we just need like $50 or $100 million to get it started. And can the governor put that in his budget? That's my question.
Yes, so I think I can tackle both. So Washington Cares, for folks who know, that we've had the seeding of the fund, we have dollars there. You're absolutely right, Charles. Like, it's going to be about how much funding is there. I'm hoping there's some funding there in the government. I think all of us are hoping. I know I've been very confident in the colleagues from my caucus who've been working on that through interim, and I know folks want to get it right. And I think it's a really unique and wonderful opportunity for our state. So I'm really looking forward to continued investment there. And I hope the executive does the right thing in that regard. For my anti-displacement property tax exemption, thank you so much for asking about it. It's at an intersection of so much that I care about, tax equity, but more importantly, what is it for folks to actually have the home that they call their home, and know that they can be secure in it. The reason I introduced this bill is that for the 37th district, when we saw the real estate bubble burst, the number of aunties and folks that we saw in district who owned their homes outright, but because of gentrification and the assessment on the values of their home, could no longer keep up with the assessed value, and what that meant for the increase of their property taxes was astronomical. What that means for Black families in Washington state is that we have not seen an increase in Black wealth, not income, wealth, which is what you acquire and pass on generationally, since 1969. It is not lost on me that we have not seen an increase since the first year in which Black people could vote in every state in the country. I don't think that's a coincidence. For most of us, our home is our vehicle to wealth. So if I have worked and toiled my whole life to have that roof over my head, and something puts me out of being able to keep it, that's a huge impact. It's a pretty simple fix. It looks at an up to $250,000 exemption on your primary residence only from state portion of your property tax. The biggest concern folks have had is that it does leave a hole in our budget. Right now, our upside down tax code has way too much burden on working families and homeowners and not on the wealthy who should be paying their share, which means property tax pays for most of the basic needs we have in the state, including our need for healthcare investment and public education infrastructure. I am not willing to just have a hole in the budget and say, figure it out. I do have Republican colleagues who are. There is a companion from Linda Wilson in the Senate that leaves that hole. What we established was a fund that would be the Tax Equity and Justice Fund, where another revenue source, Representative Frames has said very graciously, and I agree, that she thinks the wealth tax could be a good accompaniment to this if we would rebalance our tax code, that would replace those funds so that we would not have a hole in the budget or our considerations of what we spend in public dollars, but would have relief for working families and protection for their home. So I'm really excited about the possibilities there. We've done a lot of stakeholdering to refine that bill. It's really elegantly written in a way that has a built-in progressiveness, even though it's a flat exemption. Up to $2.5 million of house assessment. So if I give you $250,000 and your house is worth $2.5 million, you're probably doing okay. And that's only 10% off of your property tax bill. But if I'm someone who has a $500,000 assessment value on my home, 50% off my property bill just made a huge difference. So I'm really excited about the conversation continuing about what that can look like to give hopefully relief to folks all over our state to know that they'll have their home and be able to pass it on to the next generation.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I'm sorry to cut off this discussion because it's really awesome to hear all this great information, and I really appreciate you guys bringing in engaging. But looking at the clock, it's 7:14, and I want to make sure that we are being respectful of everybody's time. So we have one last little slide to do some wrap up, and then we can call the night. So Max, if you don't mind putting the last slide on here just to do some last comments. All right. So one more, please. Okay, sorry, one more, please. Great. We would love to help you guys be engaged. It is our duty and bread and butter and passion to help engage health voices in advocacy and policy, and we would really love to work with all you guys. I put a note in the chat that if you didn't get your question answered, or if you'd like to speak more about this in general, or just connect with WPSR about any of the policy work we're doing or the task forces, please always feel free to reach out to me or Tasia for information on the climate and or economic inequity programs. We have monthly meetings with our task forces, which is just sort of the nearest and dearest volunteers, but it's open to anybody who'd like to join. So if that's something that's of interest to you, please shoot us a note and we can rope you into those meetings. And then each of us will also be keeping our folks updated as session progresses. I think we might have slightly different models, but both of us will be sending updates, action alerts, making sure that everybody who would like to be signed up and in the loop for the bills that each of our programs are tracking is getting that information in a timely manner, and that you're getting materials that you can use to engage and advocate. So please, if you would like to continue this work, we would really love to have you. It's as easy as adding you to a list and giving you updates, or we could add you to a task force. There are choose your own adventure levels for how much you want to be engaged, and there's a size that fits everybody. So please, please reach out to us if you would like to stay involved during session. And I will let Tasia take the last comments.
Yes, thank you, Nick. You can see the dates there for our next meetings. I think Charles put in the chat that we are having a meeting on the 25th of January. That's going to be an open meeting. All of you are welcome. If you want to get engaged, get a more detailed sense of what our policy priorities are, what's coming up, how you can just plug right in, please join us for that. Just give me an emails there. We'll send out that information as well, and we'll hook you up with the links. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Representative Harris-Talley, for joining us and providing your insights. Thank you all for taking this time out of your night. I know you're all busy, so it means a lot that you joined us. And please stay connected. We'd love to work with you, collaborate with you, engage. get some rest. Also, that's important heading up to the legislative session. It can be pretty intense. And have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Awesome work, Tasia and Nick. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mark.
Mark. Have a good night, all.
Awesome job. I'll second Mark's awesome job.
Thank you, Ken.
Here, here. Good job. Yay. Woo.
Okay.
Nick, I think you can stop recording
Oh,
now.
yeah, duh, I should do that, huh?